So we have okay. I know we're super excited about doing stuff. Should I yes. There's a. All right, welcome back, everybody. We are running a little bit late, but Brian promised me to keep it short. So the next session is titled "What's Going On in the Communication of Research." We're very pleased to have our first speaker who will join us virtually via Hangout. Björn Brems, professor of neurogenetics at the Universiteit Regensburg. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He is, besides being professor, very visible in the social web with a blog where he writes about science, but also about publishing and other. Oh, sorry, he's probably more interesting. And also has a Twitter account, so I'm very curious to hear how he tackles this. The floor is all yours, Brian. Björn, sorry.
Thank you very much for having me. I apologize for not to in person. There's too many meetings on that I would like to attend, and I'm really sorry I can't make a meeting and engagements that I have. So let me just screen share presentation. I have a quick one. So start that. And go back here.
We don't see your slides yet, Björn.
Yes. You're good. Let's see. You should. Now you should.
Yeah, we can see it. Are you on a cabled internet or on Wi-Fi?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Okay, good. Very good.
And you should be a new building be hooked up with your net connection.
Okay.
So,
go ahead.
Is there a way for me to see the shift? We tested, I could see, otherwise, leave it at about it. Slides on, and we will think about what came when I read the introduction, the session on in the community research. There's the belief that we as researchers increase our converse line. We'll discuss.
Björn, sorry to interrupt. We sort of hear every second part of your word, so it doesn't really make sense to us here, which has very little to do with you, but more with us or the internet. What we would like to suggest is that we move ahead to Brian, who is here in the audience and will give his talk first, and then Kat and you will find out another way, maybe via Skype.
Oh, I do perfect.
Yeah. Renee, can you say something? Maybe.
Hi.
Can you say
it?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Is it okay in terms of hearing every second word or every first word, or?
Actually, all the words.
Good.
So I don't know.
I don't know. Could it be once we start sharing the screen that it struggles?
It shouldn't be, but we can give it a try with Renee.
Okay.
Björn, you can get out of Hangout and then join again. Maybe that helps also.
Okay.
Your connection might be more fruitful.
Okay, you ready?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. So you should hopefully be able to see my slides.
Yes, we do.
Fantastic. Thank you for allowing me to speak. It's really great to be able to connect to you from almost 4,000 miles away. So it's, even if it's spotty, it is the power of the internet, I think. And I'm going to be speaking about, my field and how science communication really has changed in the last, I would say, even 5 years. So I'm an astrophysicist. That's not my phone.
No, that was me.
So I'm an astrophysicist at Princeton University, and I'm a TED fellow. So I do a lot of science communication. But really, I would say even when I was doing my PhD, if you told someone that you were interested in communicating science, they told you that it's fine to communicate science as long as you don't tell anyone about it. There was really a stigma against the communication of science, and what I've put here is a screen grab from a application, the Ernest Rutherford Postdoctoral Fellowship application from the Science and Technology Funding Council in the UK.
Renee, sorry, we only see the first slide.
Oh.
I don't know whether you moved on, but we didn't.
So you only see my name?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, that's strange.
Well, you can use the PowerPoint. Oh, you have to share the entire screen.
Ah, share the entire screen. Okay, let me share the entire screen.
Already bigger? Oh, that's you.
I am now sharing the entire screen. Can you see me? Can you see it now? If I do that?
Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay, so this is me. Great. I've been recently applying for postdoctoral fellowships, and I decided to take a screen grab of this. So this is the Ernest Rutherford Fellowship sort of requirements, and you can see on the fifth bullet point, there's actually a specific section devoted to public engagement, and this I think has changed in the last 5 years. Science communication has gone from something you did when you were too stupid as a graduate student to know that you shouldn't, to something that's really being valued by funding councils, both in the UK and where I am at the moment in the US. And I think that that's really interesting and valuable, seeing that there's a sort of a financial imperative as well to be doing this kind of work. I also find when I speak to new students that the focus really has gone from seeing science communication as something that's beneficial to their careers as really, in addition to their passion. They see that if they're better at communicating, things will do well. And this is evidenced recently. We had a lot of graduate students applying to Princeton University, and the fact that we have quite a visible public outreach profile was actually cited by many of them in their applications as reasons why they wanted to come to the department, is because they wanted to fit in and be able to do science communication and science outreach. So it's seen as a way to attract students, and it's seen by students themselves as a way to further their careers, particularly in the market where whether or not you get a faculty position at the end of the day is uncertain, whereas communicating science is seen to be a more, a continually viable career. So I'm on the next slide. Shout if you don't see a Harvard University logo. And so the desire to communicate science is actually been driven partly internally as well. So this is another screen grab. I was on a panel discussion at ComSciCon, which is a workshop hosted by Harvard University in the US, but organized really by the graduate students themselves. It's a cross-science workshop devoted to learning skills and having discussions about the how, when, and why of communicating science to the public. And my panel was on diversity and being a woman in science, but there were panels as far-reaching as interacting with governments and interacting with the media, how to deal with controversial topics like global warming and bioethics. And there really was a broad program. And this is organized by the students themselves because they realize that there are skills that they want to learn. They want to become effective in science communication, and it's something that's really valued. So I think the culture is changing and has been changing for the last few years. One of the ways we do this, so science communication is changing. So this was something called Science Train. To give you a little bit of background, myself and some colleagues realized that generally when we communicate science, it's because someone comes to listen to me speak. And so in a sense you have a captured audience, but we realized that a lot of the time the topics of science and the message of science was not being distributed to those who really won't encounter it anyway. And so we decided to ride the public transit in New York City and spend the day just in the subway, on the trains, talking to people about astronomy. This ended up being picked up by news outlets, and so there's a photo of me accosting the American public talking about science. But I think that this kind of guerrilla science movement, where people are no longer just staying at home or staying in the office and giving a science talk to kids at school, I think this is also something that's changing and that's growing. And in fact, I recently have started collaborating with colleagues in Dublin about whether or not we can start to evaluate how effective these guerrilla science methods are, how the longevity of the programs really changes the public's perception of science, and how we can be more effective at targeting audiences that we normally wouldn't really have access to. So why do we communicate? Well, I'm in a field that wouldn't exist but for the good favor of governments around the world. Astrophysics doesn't particularly change your day-to-day life, particularly the stuff that I do, and so we know that there's a correlation between the public being interested in your field and the desire to give you funding. But also we really just want to share the joy of and the excitement of what we do and why we do science. And so that's, I'd say, one of the main reasons why people still communicate science. How do we communicate? So this is just a screen grab of my website. I have a blog which I write with a colleague, and time to time I've done a radio show, I do videos, I work with the TED team to make animated videos about science, and you'll find that everyone has sort of their own distinct platform, and many scientists and communicators at the moment are trying very, very many different things. So they'll try a few things and see how it works. And I think this is also something that's changing, is the media that we use really changes. As an example of this, I want to highlight something that's been playing itself out in the media over the last few months, and I think really epitomizes the shift in science communication and the altmetrics around it. So on March the 17th, actually, so the announcement was made on the 17th of March 2014 about the detection of gravitational waves by scientists based at Harvard, but actually the rumors of the discovery had circulated about a week in advance, and so the shot that you have now, the Guardian article, is actually from 3 days before the announcement. So there was enough hype that major news outlets were starting to write about it even before it happened. The morning of the 17th of March, the public press conference was held at Harvard. Within about 10 minutes, the server had crashed because so many people were logging on. And my colleagues and I decided to read the papers together online. And we started to just tweet about what we saw in the papers. So there were, about, say, maybe 100 astronomers that were reading and discussing with each other and the public at the same time. It was this really interesting start to the whole debate. I tried to look up the statistics, and there have been over 3,000 Bicep2 tweets about the papers and the whole event, and it was the first time that I'd really noticed very strongly that the science community started using these different media platforms to look inward and not outward. So we were communicating science, but actually to each other and not necessarily only to the public. There still is a Bicep2 Facebook group, which at the moment has 1,261 members, And this is an extremely active group where we discuss some of the papers and some of the results, and we try to make sense of this very big discovery. And this, of course, is an open group, so it's visibly open, so people can look at it, and the media have picked up on this as well. And 6 months later, it continues to be a very widely used group for discussions. Based on the work and sort of understanding things, some colleagues realized that there was potentially a flaw in the analysis, and that some of the hype that the signal was really the smoking gun of an inflationary time was actually potentially more related to dust, and so there was some kind of astrophysical explanation rather than a deep primordial cosmological one. And this again was something that was picked up by Twitter and via Facebook, and has really gained a huge amount of attention by the public media. Around this time, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not there was something wrong with the peer review process. So to put it in context, the BICEP 2 papers were released publicly on the archive preprint server before they had gone under peer review. And so initially journalists picked this up as an example of how peer review was broken and how they should have waited and this would have been caught. But I would argue that really what was starting to happen was an open access peer review, because rather than having 2 or 3 reviewers for a journal, we had 1,000 scientists look into this result and review it publicly in the public eye, and I think that that's really important. And just yesterday, there's a blog by a particle physicist called Resonances, and just yesterday there was a really interesting post where after the dust has settled, excuse the pun, we looked at what was good and bad about the results and the analysis and the comment. And this sort of discussion and debate, I think, is extremely healthy for the community and is something that's quite new. So as we move into this new world of science communication in my field, we really aren't just doing this on a small scale. There was an article recently with the top 10 science stars of Twitter, and gave various citation statistics on them, numbers of followers and tweets, etc. And it really is becoming a huge kind of business, this science communication. I am unfortunately not on there, but you can see there are lots of a variety. There are particle physicists, there are astronomers, and it's becoming a really big business to communicate science and to really share your ideas globally. So I think rather than just sticking with citation count and influence internal to the field from small talks and small interactions, we're really moving into this mass communication era where scientists are able to not only give their message to the public through various forms of media, but are actually interacting with scientists they may not have met before with new kinds of platforms. And we're using these altmetrics to really say and to understand scientific personas independently from their peer-reviewed outputs. Now, I'd be interested to find out what, at the end of this conference, how you sort of attack this area and think about how we can relate those to the standard kinds of peer review criteria. But really, I feel we're moving into a different age of science communication, both internally and externally to our field. And this is only really made possible with these new platforms. So thank you.
Thank you. Very kind. Are there any questions? Renee? I can kick off. So I was actually wondering how, what you're doing with the blogging and all the other efforts you put to communicate science. How much time is that actually taking you, and what does your boss think about that?
Yeah, I mean that's a very interesting point. I'm reasonably active in science communication. I have a lot of different projects at different levels, and of course I'm not currently being paid for any of it, so it's stuff that I try and make up the time elsewhere. But there are fellows in my department who are funded, some fraction of their time is actually funded for outreach. So the National Science Foundation has these pockets where they actually give money. But at the moment, I'd say there's still a long way we need to go for that, because it's still seen as I need to make up the research time elsewhere if I'm going to do this. But that being said, my department doesn't tell me not to. You know, they're very supportive of the things that I do.
Other questions? I don't see any other questions. I guess it was very clear for everybody. And that's the time. All right.
Great.
Thank you.
That's a pleasure.
Björn.
So, should we try? What does the sound say now? Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clearly now. It's an improvement with last time, so let's go ahead. The floor is open.
Again. All right. So let's see if we can get this going. So let me start the presentation, and then get back and screen share. So now you should see the presentation. Is that working? Can you see the slides?
Yes, we do.
Okay, good. So it's actually, it was really good that Renee was talking before I did, because I'm going to present a little bit of the next stage of perspective. About 6 to 8 years ago, I was in a similar situation where I already had my own lab, but it was more or less like a glorified postdoc at the time. And I could have given a very similar presentation as well. I was at the Science Online meeting in Raleigh-Durham in North Carolina, and you know, the original, so to say, original one that was organized and put together by Bora Zivkovic at the time. And we sort of were thinking along the same lines. Yeah, science is taking off online, and everything is more and more online. Very soon we'll do these and those, all sorts of things online, and everything is going to be on the web, and we'll communicate on the web and all those sorts of things. And in my perspective, not a whole lot has changed since then. So we're still thinking, well, soon everything, more and more people will move online, and it'll be, you know, more scientific online than it's ever been. It's sort of, and it is to some extent. But clearly, looking back 6 or 8 years, not a whole lot has changed, I would say. So that's the point I'm going to try to make. And it's going to be from a different perspective now. For the last 2 years now, I've been tenured faculty. And so a lot of things in the way my work day is organized, or my work week is organized, has changed quite a bit that I didn't foresee. And so that's why I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that change might be, and why that perspective might differ from that of a postdoc, which I was until not too long ago. So just to remind everyone, this is a screenshot from the Wayback Machine, from a page of Nature from October 1996. So that's quite some time ago. And the reason I show it is just to remind everyone that essentially everything in terms of literature, or a lot of it, was online almost 20 years ago, right? So that's just the time scale in which we're moving online. The first, you know, literature being online on a massive scale with archives and everything on PDF is about 20 years ago, just to put some of the quotes I'm going to show a little bit in perspective. And so in the description of the session here, it said, one of the things said that the conversations are moving online. And so I'll be talking a little bit on the ways in which one can do that online. I'm not going to be exhaustive. I'm just picking 4 examples about blogging, online commenting on papers, email, which is, you know, you can argue whether that is online or offline, and Twitter, of course. So if I look back, and this is now a graph, a made-up graph, essentially, about how my time, how it felt, how my time was distributed in a usual work week. And so you can see the different colors. They say, you know, how much time in a week did I spend with experiments, with the literature, going to conferences, teaching, meetings, and all kinds of things with other people, lab meetings, other meetings. how much I spend reviewing papers, grants, or whatever, how much I give talks, how much time I spend with my children, which I didn't have at the time, so that's 0. How much I went partying, or how much I went to sports. So this is, you know, how it felt. This doesn't mean anything in hours or percent. This is just how my life felt. Well, this is how my life feels today. That there's way too many conferences to go to. There is a fair amount of teaching, which isn't too bad, which isn't too much, which is just fine. There's a lot more meetings that are, for the most part, horribly boring if they're not lab meetings and we're doing actual science in them. There's a lot more reviewing of bachelor theses, master theses, PhD theses, all of those things. So clearly, my blogging has taken a hit, and now when previously I was happy to get out a blog a week, now I'm extremely happy to get out a blog post per month, and that usually doesn't happen. And so if one thinks that just because more and more young people are taking up online conversation in the form of blogging or otherwise, things will rapidly change. The amount of time available for that sort of thing just decreases to an extent that I did not expect. Then online commenting is of course something that I also did on a lot of papers. Now, since I barely have time to read any papers these days, how am I supposed to comment on them? Well, clearly, if I want to comment on a paper, I need to read it. If I have hardly time left reading it, of course, there'll be even less time commenting on it. And if then some of those comments, depending on how I formulate them or not, may end up in some author suing me because I make a mistake and accuse them of some wrongdoing or not. He may sue me otherwise, he or she may sue me either way. Clearly, that doesn't really increase the incentives of commenting online on other people's work either. So that's just an extreme example of the kind of non-incentives we have these days of actually using our intellectual capacity and our creative potential online. Email, well, you know, that's probably one of the functions of the online functions of the net that have been around, the functionality has been around among the longest. And so the other day at one of those mini meetings, a colleague asked me saw my computer, and when I was checking my RSS feeds to see if there's any literature that I should read but I can't, and he asked, well, what's that? What do you have there? And I told him, this is my RSS, my feed reader. I'm like, oh, what's RSS? I have set up email alerts. They were just worked fine for me. And so that was another faculty member that just had never heard of what RSS is. Or I had a long discussion. What's wrong with sending Word documents around? Because I was complaining that I can't keep track of the corrections that people make. I mean, we start out right using Google Documents, but as soon as there are references in there and the references have to be negotiated, then of course you need an application that can handle scientific references. And unfortunately, there's not an online tool around where you can use collaborative writing, where you can work decently with scientific references. And the colleague had never done anything other than sending Word documents around and didn't think there was anything wrong with it. I reacted apparently not very appropriately because he very quickly said he needed to get another beer and left the discussion. And then at a recent panel on open science, an open science panel, the moderator asked, okay, well, who wants to start? Why are we actually here? Why do we discuss open science in 2014? And nobody seemed to want to say anything. And so I said, well, we're here because our infrastructure is antiquated, and essentially we're using email and the internet for browsing, and that's about it. We're not using any modern technology by and large, with some exceptions, but we're not really using any modern technology, modern online technology in science. And then immediately the lady next to me in the panel started commenting on that and said, well, what do you mean our infrastructure is antiquated? It is not all literature on the web these days. So that was perfectly fine for her, that in principle, the literature is available online. She doesn't have to go to the library and copy it anymore. But of course, as you've seen, on the first slide, it's been like that for since the 90s already, and actually, in terms of functionality, not a whole lot has changed. But quite obviously, for a lot of people, that doesn't really matter all that much. And just to pick up the 50 science stars of Twitter, that of course was a huge own goal by Science Magazine, with barely 4 female Twitterers or scientists, 4 out of 50, and with a discussion that on a technical level or technological level that is probably more akin to a different publication rather than one of the most esteemed, even though there's probably not really any empirical basis for that, ranking one of the most esteemed science journals. And so if that's the sort of, if that is the highest level or the highest technical level of discussion that Science Online has today among practicing scientists and in leading, so-called leading journals, then this is quite appalling, if you ask me. Another thing that I got on the desk today is a final report on a transdisciplinary and transfaculty working group of the Free University Berlin, which is where I spent the last 10 years as a group leader before I got tenure here at my new university in Regensburg. And one sentence in the summary seemed very interesting, and I quoted it in the bottom. You've probably read it by now. There are signs that these new forms of communication and the acceleration of the scientific discourse they entail may profoundly alter scholarly publishing. Well, this is something that this working group might also have written already in 1996. And so I'm not quite sure that things really are moving at the pace that we, and I assume the audience counts just as well as to the avant-garde in terms of scientific communication online as anybody else who's following this online. But I think that probably the distance between the avant-garde and the maybe so-called Luddites is actually increasing. So while we're in fact moving, while the avant-garde is enlarging, there's definitely more people, and while we keep pushing the boundaries and keep trying to develop and use new technology, the distance to the bench scientists, to the majority, is actually increasing. Because the majority of scientists, they don't even realize that there's a need for improvement, that there's technology out there that they're using themselves in their daily lives outside of science, that we actually could use this technology in science. So what we need to do to get people ahead is not just to tell them, oh, look at what you're missing, and because all they're going to reply is to say, well, as the question to Renee was, how do you have time with that? That's what they're going to answer. And so what we need to do, in my opinion, is we need to show them what a time saver modern technology actually is. And so I'm going to, in the last couple of minutes, show you the couple of things that we try to develop in order to show people what kind of a time saver technology actually can be. So we're, interestingly enough, being neuroscientists, my former postdoc Julien Colomb and I are starting to develop infrastructure in collaboration with other people that I'm going to show. But most of the work that I'm showing now is the work of Julien Colomb. This is a picture of three of our experiments. There, it is more or less ancient or more or less modern analog and digital electronics. So what we need software to control the experiments and save that data, and we need software to analyze and visualize the data. All our data have been digital for as long as I've been in this business, which was around 1994, 5, something like that. And so what we do is we put our software on SourceForge, for instance. We also have it on GitHub. These sorts of things change. This is the first problem, obviously, is that our intellectual output is, to a large extent, software, and there's no place to actually put it. And if SourceForge goes down or GitHub goes down, then our intellectual output will not be accessible anymore. So we're working with a DFG funded project, SciForge, to develop a way of generating and archiving and making accessible scientific code with persistent identifiers. That's one of the things that we do. This is similar to something that Zenodo is doing together with GitHub, and other areas are doing this. You can see that here, the GitHub integration that Zenodo is doing, so you can get the DOI for your software. Another thing that we're doing is we're trying to improve and save time by automating the deposition of data. So the way scientific data production may work these days, at least in our lab, is that you design an experiment. If you look at the upper left, let me see. Can you see my mouse? Can you see my mouse pointer? Can you see that?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so you start with the experimental design, and you produce raw data and the metadata with it. And from those raw data and the metadata, you generate a graph and statistics, and that eventually goes into a publication, and then you have to put the data and the publication, often separately, into different databases. And so instead, what we're trying to do now is we want to have all the data, in addition to going into graphs and statistics, automatically go into an open database, such that in the publication we essentially just have to cite that data, and that the data is automatically public. We do that by programming our scripts in a way such that whenever we call our script, the data is automatically made accessible without us even wasting another click on it. For the moment, we use Figshare for that. I'm currently working with our library here that they can duplicate the Figshare functionality such that we can actually host the data in our, such that we can actually open the data in our, store the data in our library rather than at our company, because it's, when one looks at our literature, then we get the idea that it's probably not a very good idea to give our intellectual products to companies that are not very reliable. One of the mechanisms or one of the techniques that we use to access Figshare is to use the R Figshare plugin for R, which you can see depicted here. And then we run our script, and then the figure that we see on our screen with our graphs and our statistics is automatically uploaded to Figshare, and you can access and actually cite that data and that figure. And so, and when on the next day you increase the number of animals in the experiment, you increase the sample size, then this data just gets amended, and you don't generate a new article, you just amend it until the data is done and the experiment is done, and then you can cite that and you can use it in your publication eventually. And yes, it is citable. We use DataCite to automatically, or actually Figshare uses DataCite to automatically generate a DOI for all of those experiments. So if you would be able to click on this link, you would be taken to this page on Figshare. And so this is citable, and the data are accessible for reviewers or whoever would like to see it. One of the things we want to do in the future, if you look at the tags that you can see here, if you look at those tags, let me zoom in on those, what you see here on the lower right is the number of the transgenic fly line that we use. We use the fly stock of Drosophila fruit flies for these experiments, and the idea, of course, is then to link this to the major databases, in this case Flybase, where all the phenotype and genotype data of the different fly strains that are available are collected. And finally, we're trying to use the availability of our code and the availability of our data to try to get rid of generating figures ourselves. One of the things that takes a lot of time in preparing manuscripts is to generate a figure that fits to the conditions that the publishers set up. So ideally, of course, what I would want to do is I would say, well, in this place, call this data and evaluate it with this code, and then I would like to be done with it, right? 2 sentences, one saying this is the data that should be displayed here, and then another link to the code that should be called to display the data, and that's it. And so a few weeks ago, we published the first proof of principle that this sort of thing works with Faculty of 1000 Research. This is the paper. And if you look at figure 3, then what you first will find is that it says loading. And what it does, it's actually loading the data and calculating a box plot from it that then looks like this. And then if you look at the box here in the upper left, replot figure, you can, from a pull-down menu, you can pull down and choose a different way of display data. And when you do that, then you'll see that all the outliers have been plotted separately now. And we now only show in the whiskers, we show the 10 to the 90th percentile. In this case, of course, this doesn't change a whole lot in the graph. It doesn't have to. It's merely a proof of principle that if we were to have an infrastructure that takes care of all of our data, all of our software, then we could actually focus on the, was that the time bell? Yes, I'm done. Then we could actually focus more on science and have more time for communicating science. And clearly those are all online technologies, and if those were combined with social technology, which is indeed more recent than 1996, but if we could combine that with social technology, then we would actually have an infrastructure that would pull people into the 21st century and get people to use online technology rather than using online technology from the state of 1996. So that's essentially what I was going to say. And now I think my video should be displayed again. Yes, I can see that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a very interesting talk. I may have one thing to add for you for your list. Although your email conversation is very entertaining, I know there are some people in the Netherlands, also a neuroscientist, Lucien Engelen, and he actually got rid of his entire email box and is only available via Twitter and Google+. So maybe that's an idea for you to save more time on needless discussions. Questions from the audience?
May I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead. You're also audience.
Thanks for the talk. It was interesting to see our differences of view, and I think I definitely stand by all of your efforts to make things more streamlined, because that is a huge factor, and I think it's also part of the open access movement and transparency, so that's very, very important. But I think the fact that, you know, your colleagues don't realize that Google Docs allows for Latex editing, where you can put in references or things like that, surely speaks a little bit to the education of the field and the inertia rather than the technologies themselves. Because I think there are a lot of technologies that have come about that aren't being adopted by people at certain stratas in the academic hierarchy. But I wouldn't blame the technology, I would blame the hierarchy.
Right. So I mean, that's a very valid counterpoint, obviously, and that's one that's often brought. I tend to think from seeing the kind of time constraints that people have, that if something saves enough time, people will use it, and so I think and I mean, Latex is a very excellent example. I mean, I learned coding in high school. And so for me, it would not be a big issue of starting to use Latex if my colleagues would also do that. But clearly, my fellow biologists, they essentially only go online to search for, to paste their sequences and look for other sequences. and having them, use LaTeX would actually be a little bit too much to ask, and would probably, in terms of the learning curve that's required, would probably first take them more time than it would eventually save them. And in fact, the person I talked to didn't really see anything bad about, sending emails around. So if now I tell him, look, you could actually save some time and improve by, using LaTeX and Google Documents, he said, well, what is there to improve? Right? So what one would need is technology that is intuitive and immediately, is point and click, essentially. That's what I mean by intuitive. And is point and click, and it immediately saves people time.
Any further questions? Yeah, there's one in the back.
Does Beyond use Altmetrics?
Sorry?
Does Beyond use Altmetrics?
The question is whether you use Altmetrics.
I follow my own Altmetrics, so yes, I do vanity Altmetrics. That's what I do. It depends on how much I want to know about someone else to check someone else's Altmetrics, but I do that as well. But I follow the development in as much as they're available free of charge. So as of right now, they are not. I don't use them in a way that would justify spending money on them. But clearly, if so far in those last 2 years, I have not been on a search committee. All the new people that were hired in the department here were hired before I came. So whenever I will be in a search committee and I realize that people use journal-based metrics, I will clearly make my best efforts to make sure that Altmetrics will be used and article-level metrics will be used, at the very least, in addition to, if not in replacement of journal-based metrics.
There's another.
Harvey from River Valley. Just a very quick technical point. Do you think that these, it's wonderful to see that figure generating itself in the F1000 publication. Is the problem that perhaps the whole industry is too PDF-centric? We think of the PDF as the publication. Perhaps we get away from that, we can have all these new possible innovations.
I think you got the question.
I think I got the question. What I heard was that the entire literature is too PDF-centric and that the functionality of PDF is essentially non-existent, and I would definitely
the industry
agree with that.
I'm not.
Can I just, so I tweeted about this just during the discussion. There's actually a lot of work going into embed interactive figures within PDF using things like Python and JSON. So actually, I think even the PDF discussion is changing. Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, clearly, I mean, we need to have modern functionality in our literature. I mean, the metaphor I always use is that right now, the functionality of our literature wouldn't really decrease significantly if we just would carve it all in stone and take our cell phones and take pictures of our literature and post them online. This would probably not deteriorate the functionality of our literature. So clearly, there's a lot to be done on the functionality of our literature.
Okay, thank you both. We move on to our next speaker, who is actually in the building. Our next speaker is Brian Wecht, who is the co-founder of Story Collider, and their core business is actually communicating research.
I can just stand up here at the front.
That's not speak in the microphone.
Oh, I need to speak into the microphone?
Yes, otherwise Google doesn't hear you.
Okay, that's cool. Let me just pour some water. Hi guys, I'm Brian. Yeah, no, I'm just pouring water. So, despite, you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from here, but I do live here in London now. I'm a faculty member at Queen Mary, University of London, where I'm in the Center for Research on String Theory. So I'm a theoretical physicist. I work on particle physics, string theory, supersymmetry, all that kind of untrue stuff. And I think what I want to tell you about is what we've been doing at the Story Collider, which is something I started with Ben Lilly about 5 years ago now. But I think in order to frame what we do at the Story Collider, I need to tell you a little bit about my personal story and how I got into it. So hopefully that'll help illustrate at least part of the point of why I think this is a valuable, useful, and most of all really fun thing to do. So I didn't start out my academic life as a physicist. My original degree, which was from a small liberal arts college in Western Massachusetts, was music. So I started out as a jazz musician, composer, arranger, performer kind of guy. And during my last year of university, I took quantum mechanics, and it totally changed like everything, man. I just loved it. I was super excited about it, and I was like, okay, forget about music. I'd actually gotten into a PhD program in music, and I was like, no, quantum mechanics. I want to do that. I want to do physics. It also helped that my girlfriend at the time was moving to San Diego to do a PhD in economics, and my PhD in music was not going to be in San Diego. So essentially, I figured out the best way to follow this girl to California was to try to get into the physics department at San Diego, which I somehow did, despite not being a physics major as an undergraduate. And then I just found myself doing a physics PhD, and I fell in love with quantum field theory and string theory. And then I ended up, doing a PhD in that and having some nice results and stuff. But all this while, I kept up the kind of performance side of my life as well. I was doing music the whole time. I was performing in local bands, and one thing I started to get involved with in San Diego was improv comedy. So San Diego is a small little comedy scene going on there. I took some classes, and it was really fun, and I started doing that. And when I moved to my first postdoc at MIT, Boston had this amazing comedy scene as well. So I started doing musical improv. I became the musical director of an improv theater in Boston while doing string theory research. I was about to say string theory research on the side, but it was really the other way around. And finally, so I did 3 years in Boston. Met my wife, who was an actress at the improv theater that I worked at. We're married. We have a 4-month-old baby now. And then for my second postdoc, I moved to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. So you might wonder where this is going, having to do with the Story Collider. But the point is, when I moved to the New York area, which is actually where I grew up, I found about this thing that was happening in New York called storytelling. And I think in order to set the scene for what's going on here, I have to tell you what storytelling means, because storytelling means a lot of things to a lot of people. So there was something going on in New York at the time, which actually had been started a few years ago, which is what I now call, and what many people call, Moth-style storytelling. So can I just see, show of hands, how many people have heard of the Moth? Okay, about maybe a quarter of the audience. Okay, if you have not heard of the Moth yet, I cannot recommend more highly that you check out the Moth. So here's what the Moth does. They host these things in New York, which they call story slams. And basically, they get people on stage to tell true stories about themselves. And these, essentially, the Moth, the big show that the Moth runs, a story slam, they run them now every week in New York. They get about 200 people from all walks of life. Some people are comedians, some are actors, some are just people, some are scientists, some are from everywhere. And they pick names out of a hat, and you get up on stage and you tell a story about your life. And then the cool thing that the Moth does is that they get actually the audience to score the story. So at the end of the night, there's kind of a story champion, and that person moves on to the next round, and so on and so on and so on. Well, they have these things they call the Grand Slams. So they basically started this form of, for want of a better term, competitive storytelling in New York. This was started, I don't know the exact date, but it was roughly, I'm going to say 10 or 15 years ago. And it had become this phenomenon in New York. And what was the great thing is that it was not just, it wasn't like stand-up comedy. I mean, it looks like stand-up comedy, where you have someone standing essentially in front of a microphone in front of a room of people. But the people that were doing it were not trained performers. They were just, people who had interesting stories to tell about anything. And this became a huge, huge thing in New York, where there were lines around the blocks for these Moth shows happening every week. And every week they choose a theme for the show, something like, surprises or fiction, or whatever. Fiction's a bad example, actually, because they're all these stories are true. Anyway, they'd always pick a theme every week. And when I got to New York, I found about this thing called storytelling, and I had other comedian friends who were in New York, and they said, what you've got to do, they teach storytelling classes at the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater, which is a famous comedy theater in New York. And I figured, just as I was trying to look for different ways of performing in New York, let me go take a storytelling class. And New York, I don't know if you know the geography, it's about an hour and a half away from Princeton, so I'd get on the train, I'd go into New York tonight to take these storytelling classes. And on the first day of this great storytelling class, the storytelling teacher had us all go around the room, and she said, okay, well, I want you to say, what is your unusual thing? I was like, come on, I have this nailed. I'm a postdoc in theoretical particle physics. Who else in this room can do that? And so she gets to me, and I say my thing, I'm a particle physicist. And she's like, oh yeah, there's this other guy that does storytelling that does exactly that. He's really awesome. You should meet him. His name is Ben Lilly. And so we found each other on Facebook, and we set up a date. We went on a story date. And within about, I think, 5 minutes of meeting each other and going to see a storytelling show together, which is what our story date was. That's what story date is, canonically. We decided that this idea of storytelling was so popular and so much fun and so accessible to a wide variety of people that we wanted to start our own storytelling show. But because he was, at that point, an ex-particle physicist, he'd actually just left academia, and I was still in academia as a particle physicist, we were going to start what became the Story Collider, which is a storytelling show. So again, true personal stories from anyone about science. So that was our hook, is that these are all stories that will be told live on stage. They're all true. They all happen to the person telling the story. Only our twist is that these are all about science. And one of the things I want to emphasize, one of the things that is very, I think, important, and Renee even talked about in science communication, is reaching a wide diversity of people. And I have to say, until I moved to the UK 2 years ago, I never thought of the Story Collider as science communication. I never thought of it as outreach. I never thought of it as anything but a performance and a show. And then when I interviewed for the job I now have here, they were like, tell us about this outreach project you do. I was like, oh yeah, outreach, sure. So then I realized you could actually think of this as science communication and outreach. They found videos of me online. At first, I actually started out by saying, hey, we found some videos of you online. I was like, oh. So that's what the Story Collider is. We actually, within about, I don't know, 2 or 3 months of having that idea, we found a venue in New York, and we got 6 storytellers. And that was about 4.5 years ago now. The Story Collider we celebrated our 4th anniversary this past May. So we're looking at 4.5 years of science stories. And what we found in New York is that not only was there an immediate audience for it, the shows started off with, I think, about 50 people coming, and they've only grown from there. There was an amazing diversity of storytellers. So one of the things that we really try to do at the Story Collider is these science stories. Our point is that everybody has a story about science. And we make a very explicit point of not having our storytellers be all scientists. At a typical show, about half the storytellers are actual scientists. Many are telling stories about their research. But the other half of the storytellers they're actors, they're writers, they're comedians, they're auto mechanics, bartenders we've had, just people who come from anywhere in the world, any different type of career path, any different type of life, but they're all telling stories about their personal experiences with science. And this is something we've been able to keep up for, as I said, about 4.5 years now. And despite starting in New York, where Ben and I both were, Ben stayed in New York, and my academic career took me on path which ended up here. We've now kept our monthly show. We do a monthly live show in New York where we get the typical format for a show is 6 storytellers. Everyone tells about a 10-minute story, all true, all stories about stuff that happened to themselves, all about science. So we do a show which lasts about 2 hours with 6 storytellers telling roughly 10 to 15-minute stories. We keep that going monthly in New York, and now we've also expanded to different places, not only in the US, but here in London as well. So in fact, we just did our 6th or 7th London show last night here at a venue in Shoreditch, a very nice venue called the Book Club. So there's not too much else to say about the Story Collider, except that we have found that one of the most exciting things to me is that the audience that comes to these things, I say only about a third of the audience are actually people that I would say are actively engaged in the science communication world. There are a lot of people, we get tons of people who are just coming at it as a theatrical experience. And one of the most exciting things about being here in London right now is that I think, especially in London, storytelling is not yet a separate thing. So we're starting to see the beginning of kind of a Moth-style storytelling community here in London. In fact, the Moth just started shows in London this past month, and they're going to keep up monthly shows at this venue, the Book Club in Shoreditch. I strongly encourage you guys all to attend. But storytelling is not yet a thing that people do here. So it's been fun to try to watch, actually, over the last couple of years I've been here, as this community of people doing storytelling that is not doing comedy. Not all the stories we tell are funny. Some of them are actually very tragic or very serious. This community of people telling true stories about themselves and their experiences with science has developed and grown even in the 2 years I've been here in London. We see it happening in various places around the world too. Mostly so far in English-speaking countries, but there are hints that things like this, of course, are happening in other parts of the world as well. So basically, that's what I wanted to say about the Story Collider. Maybe I can give you some examples of stories we've told, just to tell you the sorts of things we've done here. This is one that was just on our podcast last week. We're talking about technology here a lot. How do we get these stories out there? Of course, a live show can only reach, a couple hundred people if you're lucky at a time. Every week we take one of the stories from our live shows in the US or here, and we put it on our podcast, which now has at least a few million downloads. The most recent story we featured was from this guy, Ed Frenkel, who is a brilliant mathematician who, as you can see in this little synopsis down here, told a story about not being accepted to a university because his father was Jewish. And he said, you know what, I'm going to take this test anyway, and when they see how great I am, then we'll see what happens. We've had people tell stories. One of my favorite early stories was we had a paleontologist tell a story about going on a dig with a young Earth creationist. And trying to navigate that particular minefield of showing someone a dinosaur fossil and seeing what they said. My wife, Rachel, who is a comedian, not a scientist, and I'm a little biased, I think it's the best story we've ever had, told a story about how we met and how when we were working together at this improv theater in Boston, and I was a postdoc at MIT, she was an actor there, she tried to basically court me and figure out how a comedian, gets to date a scientist, as if that's some kind of privilege. And those are the kinds of stories that we feature. So now we have Ben Lilly, as I said, is the other guy I founded the Story Collider with. He's doing Story Collider full time now, and we have a third producer, the brilliant Aaron Barker, who is also not a scientist. And Ben and Aaron keep the live shows going in New York. They're both full-time Story Collider employees, and we have producers working in various cities. So we've really expanded a lot over the last few years. And to me, this is just a very exciting, vibrant, and growing field in what I now see as science communication. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. Are there any questions? Many.
Sorry, how does it pay for itself? You've got the donate.
Oh yeah. So of course that's a great question. In some sense, I'm sorry. So the question was, how does it pay for itself? In some sense, we don't really have an answer for that yet. The short answer is that a lot of it, we do get some donations. We do fundraising occasionally. We do have a store that sells a little bit of merch, but we're still trying to figure that part out in a very real way. So I wish I could say this is the business model we've come up with. We are nonprofit, I should say that, first of all, in every sense of the word. Yeah, I don't have a better answer for that because we really haven't figured it out. There's what?
There's no syndication.
No, we have advertisers on we've talked to a podcast and things like that. The podcast is free and always will be. We've talked about premium content and various things, but we don't have a great long-term solution to that yet.
Have you thought about using this storytelling model to encourage more science study amongst school children and teenagers, because we want them to get more engaged in science and pick a scientific career rather than other walks of life, and there's this gradual diminishing interest in science?
Yeah, so the question was, if you didn't hear, have we thought about using storytelling to encourage people to go into science? I would say implicitly we're already doing that. I mean, one of our stated goals is to, by demonstrating very viscerally that every different type of person, regardless of race, religion, gender, whatever, has a science story. We're trying to encourage people to think of themselves as scientists, even if they're not actually professional scientists. That does bring me actually to one thing I wanted to say that is a very explicit part of our mission as well, which is we are not an educational organization. So one thing we tell all of our storytellers, a rule of thumb, especially when we have scientists on stage as storytellers, is you get 3 sentences in a 10-minute story of actual scientific explanation. Because we don't want to talk, we don't want you to tell us how the Krebs cycle works or whatever. We want the emotional experience, the personal experience of doing science. So we very explicitly try to position ourselves as not out to educate people about what scientific concepts are. We try to think of ourselves as telling stories about what the experience of being involved with science or having science in your life, which we all have, is like. So I would say we answer that question by just demonstrating very obviously by having all these different people on stage telling science stories. But I do want to say we're not actively trying to educate people in scientific concepts. Of course, some of that is inevitable. When people are telling stories about science, they'll tell a little bit about what they do. But we definitely don't think about ourselves as an educational organization. We think of ourselves as a theatrical or a performance.
There's one question far back.
I was wondering about the parallels between Altmetrics and storytelling or stand-up comedians. So if you had to decide who to who, might it be based on the decibel count of the laughter or the applause, or the numbers of heckles,
yeah.
or the numbers of people who storm out?
It's a great question. I don't think we've ever had anyone heckle or storm out of a story collider. So yeah, please go for it. I'd love to be the first. The short answer to your question is we don't have much in the way of metrics beyond things like podcast downloads and surveys that we do. It's something certainly Ben and Aaron and I would love to experiment with, but it's not something we've really thought, or maybe I don't want to speak for them. It's not something I've thought much about in the past. I'm sure there's some very interesting stuff to be done there, but if the question was, have you thought about it, my personal answer is, sadly, no.
Last question.
You might have answered a bit in the question before, but do you do any preparation of the people who are going to go on and do stories and stuff like that?
Oh, great.
Sort of quality filter to make sure that you get good and appropriate stories on the night.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. It is something I meant to say. So all the stories at Story Collider shows are curated. So it is not, in opposition to the Moth, this is not a statement of quality of their stories in any way. People just show up and they tell a story. With our stories, we go through, there's a pitch process. We ask people to send us an email, hey, if you want to tell a story at the live show, send us an email. And then we work on drafts of the story with the storytellers. So I'd say in a typical show, for working on one 10-minute story, we go back and forth on written drafts, I'd say 2 or 3 times. And then we always try to do the stories are told without notes. People are not reading these stories from a piece of paper, but we always try to get people to read the stories to us so we can hear their voice, we can hear a little bit of flavor of what the performance is. So that's one of the reasons that I think we succeed in getting all sorts of people up on stage, is because we are very explicit that you're not going to be thrown to the wolves. You're not wolves, but you're not going to be out there without any kind of help. We will work with you, and sometimes for quite a long period of time on all these stories. And it's how, I think, in part, how we get people who are otherwise rather reluctant get up on stage to come tell their stories. Because another thing we try to do is make sure that it's not just seasoned performers. Most scientists, like me, we give talks. We're used to speaking in public. We have actors or comedians there as well. But we want the people that have never ever been on stage or never spoken into a microphone before. So we really do make a conscious effort to work for as long as necessary with the storytellers on versions of their stories. Thanks for asking.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I think Adam is taking over for me. Good.
Yeah. Oh.